Welcome to the Crisis Response Podcast, a show about the regular folks who are tackling major problems and transforming how communities watch out for each other. I'm Jason Friesen, and on the show today, how Twilio.org is transforming crisis communications around the globe. I'll be joined by Devin Brooks, the Crisis Response Program Manager for Twilio.org. We'll be sharing some of the many ways crisis response groups are using Twilio's technology to build custom communications tools and better manage their response teams. Hello, Devin. Good afternoon and welcome to our podcast. It's so nice to have you.
Thanks so much, Jason. I'm so happy to be here.
Yes, a real pleasure. We, Trek Medics, have been big fans of Twilio since our inception, and we depend on Twilio for so much of our communications. But for our listeners who are not familiar with Twilio, could you just give a little background overview of the company, what you do, and what services you provide?
Yeah, absolutely. So Twilio is probably most well known for the role that we play with text messages, but essentially we go a little bit beyond that. We are web APIs are essentially, programmable communication tools that allow for you to leverage a variety of communications channels to connect with your donors, your volunteers, your constituents, whatever that might mean. So that could definitely mean sending text messages, making phone calls, emails, WhatsApp. I mean, you name the channel and we can pretty much connect you to it, and I'll really connect you to your constituents. So example I love to give, most basic but still helpful, is when you call an Uber and a random number texts you to let you know that they're on their way. That under the hood is Twilio at work.
Right. So that's exactly the example that I like to give when I'm talking to people about Twilio as well. But like you said, you do so much more than just text messages. You also do contact centers, call centers. Could you share a couple more examples, everyday examples that people might come across and not know that they're actually connecting to Twilio's services?
Yeah, I mean, really anything that's going to be text-based, or when you call in, I think a really great example, if you call into a call center and they already know who you are, that's an API at work to recognize you and to help provide some clarity as to the background of why you're calling. That's definitely our call center at work. We like to provide, it's not necessarily out of the box, our contact center solution, but it provides some Lego blocks to allow folks to build the solution that's going to make more sense to them. We've developed to have more tools around security. Two-factor authentication is another great example of when you are almost always using Twilio. You get that text message with a secret code to verify who you are so that you can, access your personal information. And then I think another sweet spot for us is the concept of IVR and chatbots, right? So if you interact with maybe a vaccine hesitancy bot, we do our best to make sure that it feels like you're talking to someone, but secrets out. Most of the time you are not, until and unless it's been escalated to an actual human being. But, we try and do our best to provide these tools that allow nonprofits and businesses to communicate with you quickly and then get you escalated to the right person at the right time.
Excellent. Yes. So we use Twilio for their SMS, for push notifications. In Haiti, the MotoMeds program that we've been supporting for years uses your Flex system to accept calls, and then they use text messages and push notifications to dispatch responders. So you've got all these solutions, but another interesting aspect of Twilio is the social impact side of things, Twilio.org, and in particular, crisis response. You're the program manager for crisis response. Could you share more about Twilio's involvement in crisis response and how they got involved into it and where they are at it with it now?
Yeah, absolutely. So to explain a little bit more how Twilio.org differs from Twilio.com, essentially we are the social impact arm of Twilio, still part of the company, not a separate entity. We just like to make that separation to be clear about our work. And ultimately we follow the 1% model. So we pledge 1% of our product, people, and equity. That was a commitment that Jeff made long ago. And that's the lens through which we view crisis response amongst some other, major pillars of our work here at Twilio. So we actually have three broader focus areas of crisis response, which has evolved, and I'll talk a little bit about that journey, climate action, and then what we consider a category to kind of be long-term well-being. And, we're excited to focus on global health equity. Obviously, that's been made a clear gap after the pandemic. So within these three pillars, I see myself under one that we've just recently relabeled as humanitarian assistance. But really, all three of them, in my mind, are crisis response, prevention, and recovery in a nutshell. Climate being the cause of most crises these days, how we respond once that crisis occurs, and then how we offer and support resiliency as people recover. So, talking. Oh yeah, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so at one point, I think this came about, this focus in crisis has been something that we've held on to for a while. And really, there's been, new variations of what that means for us. But it became clear very early on to Twilio that, a communications tool can mean the difference between life and death and getting help in the exact moment that you need it. So it became almost a no-brainer for Twilio and for Aaron, our Chief Social Impact Officer, and Jeff Lawson, our CEO, that we've got to get involved in crisis. We've got to play the role if we can. And we launched a crisis prevention and response initiative. And at one point, we wanted to be a part of all of it, right? We had 5 different areas that we were going to focus all of our efforts under this one umbrella of crisis. And that was sexual assault, abuse, suicide prevention, and mental health kind of bundled in one, substance abuse, and natural disasters. So, of course, natural disasters is where we came, or rather cross paths with you guys.
That's exactly right. We were actually one of the recipients of the first Twilio.org Impact Fund. And it was very much tied to our work in hurricane relief, but also, like you were saying, in global health equity. But you started with the 5, and how did that go? And because there's a lot going on in those 5 categories.
Yeah, that's a meaty bunch of categories there. And I would say we did find success and some really wonderful partners in nonprofit organizations and, those outside of nonprofits within those categories. And at one point, we developed a really cool crisis response technology network to call upon customers using Twilio in some capacity, small or large, across that subset of 5 to ask them to help inform the direction that we should go in. And we, just kind of took some time to look at what the data said and where were we shining and where were we making an impact. And it was like we were making some really great impact across a lot of these categories. But we felt like if you're focused on so much, are you making the depth of impact that you really are striving to make as a social impact organization like ours who has so many resources to pull on? So we made a decision at the beginning of this year, and a lot of this was probably also impacted by COVID and starting to understand what an active role in global health equity that we could play, that we said, maybe we need to come back to the drawing board and revisit, is it better to be a little bit everywhere or really be in one place even more? And so we had a whole incredible year with our team, a lot of workshops, digging into all of the metrics that matter to us to try and figure out where we should take it, what direction made the most sense for us. So it was a cool journey. We looked at both revenue, we can't ignore it. We looked at impact. That's what drives us. We like to say we're impact led and revenue fueled, which is tricky at times in the place that we sit, finding a home for both and not deprioritizing impact first. We looked at, what our product set was. Were there limitations to those products? Were we US centric? We knew we wanted to be more globally focused, and we kind of started to pick apart those categories. We built kind of a rubric and criteria, and our team really had a field day deciding the direction we should go in. And we're excited to say that humanitarian assistance was the winner.
Yeah, absolutely. So you've narrowed it down, though clearly you have users that are still doing all the other things,
Absolutely.
the other 4 categories, but you've put your focus now, or Twilio, the company's put the focus on humanitarian assistance. And what does that translate to in practical terms? What kind of events have you been involved in? Obviously, COVID being the big one. If you could talk a little bit about that and COVID, and also beyond that, what other types of incidents or emergencies you've been involved in?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we first kind of realized when we looked at the 5 categories as we built them is that there were other ways to serve. Some of these could kind of be put in categories together, and I think in a good way, right? Because if you think about it, it was essentially personal crisis intervention became one of, I mean, you could almost put 3 or 4 of those in one. So we thought, how do we continue to serve personal crisis intervention, but really disasters, and just really not just responding right when a disaster happens. I think our sweet spot, as we learned through COVID, was how we kind of keep the world turning when no one can be in front of each other. And then we started to think about what happens when the disaster is gone, and the initial donations stop coming because in the eyes of media and the world they stop looking. So we really wanted to think about, okay, how do we continue to offer support and how can our technology be used? So I'll definitely happily share some examples of how we kind of move through this journey. And so you'll see, global health equity to us, the pandemic was so big, and there's so much we learned from vaccine hesitancy to vaccine distribution that it became a major initiative of ours outside of crisis response. And we gave it its own home because we realized that once the pandemic is gone, there will be another version of it. There are still vaccines that much of the world do not have access to or have their own hesitancies around. So we wanted to make sure that that was going to live in its own place. With regards to humanitarian assistance, while we were going through the exercise of determining the right fit for crisis response this year, obviously Ukraine kicked off right as I stepped into the role of program manager of crisis response. And thankfully, I stepped in to a role that my colleague had been in a different capacity, but had built out a wonderful playbook. So we began to respond the way we always do. We have a whole disaster response playbook. So we think again through different lenses of severity and relevance. How do we leverage product, people, and equity to respond in times of crisis? And ultimately, Ukraine became another opportunity for us to see just how much impact we could have with the right partners. So, and that was both in the nonprofit sense and the for-profit sense. Some examples, we're really proud of some partnerships with IFRC, Norwegian Refugee Council, IRC, that came out of that. Some really neat examples were, typically when you respond in times of a disaster, a nonprofit will get on the ground as quickly as they can to perform a needs assessment. And that needs assessment is to understand how many people are there, what resources they need, take that back to your team to understand what you want to bring to the table, right? How much food, water, cash, where do you need it? And ultimately that wasn't allowed on the ground in Ukraine, where many refugees were coming through. There were some martial law issues, so it needed to be digitized. Also, there's some safety concerns with just walking up to someone and sharing too much information. So thinking through the more vulnerable populations that are moving quickly and have been displaced, we think about how do we safely get information to them to allow them to make the best decisions for their safety as well. So we turned to WhatsApp using our technology in partnership with NRC to build a needs assessment tool. And it's a really neat opportunity. If you reach out and you're in the region, you can share your location on WhatsApp. That's what makes it such a cool channel to be tapped on where it's available. And from that, you can share, I am here. This is my family size. This is what we need. And then that information is fed back to the organization. And then the response can either be immediate, sharing with you the nearest resources, shelter as a major example, and it can allow the teams to follow up with a phone call so that you don't have to worry about spending any money. This is a concern we think of too when you think of some channels, but they reach out to you, they share resources, and in some instances, they share a QR code to gain or give you access to cash. And so cash programming kind of became the next wave of an example to us in this major crisis as it unfolded with Ukraine, that, wow, these are 2 really impactful use cases that we can help bring function to. So that was the beginning of our direction, I think, a little help from a big event this year.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you are learning all sorts of stuff about, you mentioned Ukraine isn't in the EU, but when you go right across the border to Poland, you now are in the EU. So there's GDPR, right? There's all of these things that you need to be aware of that we come across ourselves in all these different countries. So how does Twilio or does Twilio, how do they handle all the different regulations, right? Every country, for all intents and purposes, has their own set of rules, and they're very hard to follow, especially if you're a company that's trying to scale across countries. What does Twilio do about this regulatory environment? I mean, do you have to figure it out on your own, or does Twilio help you along the way?
Twilio absolutely helps you. And I am not always the expert when it comes to these categories, but that's why we have so many subject matter experts internally at Twilio. Compliance is incredibly important to us. As a no shenanigans, one of our values at Twilio, we take it very seriously to make sure that we are compliant with messaging. And so we have a lot of experts depending on the area in which, you're considering doing business. Our technical team will help you build it, and they will absolutely share with you the implications you need to consider with regards to data protection and security. So GDPR is one of the categories in which we're on top of our game security wise, and we'll make sure you've got the resources to kind of guide you on what you need to consider. And then closer to home, as we look at things like personal crisis intervention, then we need to consider things like HIPAA. And we've got some really wonderful healthcare subject matter experts who walk you through those considerations to ensure that all messages are compliant. And honestly, we do that, whether it's a government level compliance or it's simply more of a how you send text messages. I'd say it's to some level it's government compliance, but it's not necessarily law who you send text messages to and how you get permission to. So, those are a big part of conversations that our commercial or go-to-market teams are having with customers as well to make sure that they feel educated.
So these are, I like to say that as a private citizen, I would prefer to live in Europe, but as a business owner, I would prefer to be in the United States. And these kinds of regulations are necessary, but they are so difficult sometimes to follow. So it's really great to hear that Twilio helps you along the way, especially with HIPAA and like you're saying. So in terms of that's kind of the first big crisis that Twilio is being involved in, and clearly a ongoing crisis with major ramifications and the potential to really get out of control. Sadly, frighteningly, you
Mhm.
can you anticipate other types of crises that or disasters that Twilio is well prepared to respond to if and when they happen?
Yeah, so our strategy now is certainly not limited to major wars. That was a unique and nuanced situation that allowed us to consider how we serve crisis from a plethora of angles, including connectivity. That is, of course, key to how we work, right? Relationships with local carriers. So that said, we've responded to, I'm checking my dashboard. We've monitored pretty actively about 18 crises this year, aligned a little bit more to humanitarian assistance or our DEI team. We work very closely with them. So, we have responded to issues that aren't necessarily quite at that level. It could be wildfires is another role that we play. We've just activated an awareness campaign within Twilio for the Horn of Africa drought, which is an interesting one because it doesn't have a catalyst quite like other disasters do. And thus it doesn't necessarily rise to the attention of media in quite the same way. But climate induced crises tend to be where we have found an opportunity to respond a little bit more. So with Hurricane Ian, with the flooding in Pakistan, these are other examples of places that we've activated. But again, activation may not necessarily mean the express use of Twilio in the moment. It could mean we activate via our people, which means we encourage our employees to volunteer through crisis response partners when it's safe, or it means giving campaigns. So we've had a lot of people activations. And then, of course, we do have a humanitarian assistance grant cohort. So, we try and leave some funding for reactive response. And then we look for the organizations that are trusted within the community, are putting the community first and allowing the community to lead. And then those that are going to serve the most vulnerable populations, women and children, especially minorities, that sort of focus is the one that we like to take when responding a bit more reactively to crisis.
That makes all makes a lot of sense. How do you, kind of scaling back or stepping back, when we first got involved with Twilio, we were talking about, we do emergency response, crisis response. That's our sector. And when we
Mhm.
first got involved and we were talking with them about Flex. So Flex is the cloud-based call center platform. Makes it very easy for groups to set up a number that you can call in and then handle it through dispatchers or agents, operators, whatever the label may be, to accept incoming calls. And from our perspective, there are two sides to emergency communications. There's how the public calls for help, and then which we call intake, and then there's how you coordinate the response to that request for assistance, which is what we call dispatch. And so we've always been focused on the second part, the dispatching, with the assumption that most of the people that we were targeting already had the call intake set up. Well, as you're aware, that's not always the case. And there are actually a lot of groups that are trying to get set up and they need both sides. They need the call intake and they need the dispatch. So that's when we started looking at Flex. And, we saw, I think we were at Signal in 2019 or 2020. Can't remember which one. But we saw a quick demo of Flex. And I was like, holy cow, this is the perfect solution for on the fly or even long term emergency call centers. And we ended up using it in Malawi to set up their first national emergency call center. But we were talking with the product manager and other folks at Twilio about it, and they had said that, because I said, this should be in every 911 call center across the United States. And they said that they had considered that too, but they weren't going to get involved in that. And I imagine that's because of all the regulatory issues and also because of all the legacy technologies that these call centers or these public safety answering points are using. But now there's 988, and I'm wondering what's Twilio's involvement in 988, because this is going on across the country and happening at different velocities, right? People are on different trajectories and at different timelines. What's Twilio's involvement in 988, if any?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you bring that up. And one major reason, as I said, when we were thinking about the direction that we wanted to take crisis response, if we decided to focus, one criteria that we had to look at was our technology's, strengths and weaknesses. And at the time that we were doing that, a major limitation of Flex, albeit, we found tremendous success, or rather, through our partners, some examples being the Trevor Project or Child Helpline International, or even Partnership for Drug Free Kids, when we played the role of an anonymous hotline where you can call in and get the help that you need without ever saying who you are, Flex was an amazing fit. But ultimately, Flex just became HIPAA compliant in the back half of this year. So in that moment, and actually when 988 began to form more formally, we really wanted to play a major role, but we had to acknowledge the limitation there at the time, because we can't, of course, promise things that don't exist just yet. And there is a concern with the reliability and uptime around that. That said, some of the organizations I just mentioned are connected to 988, because ultimately 988 is meant to be essentially a call center that learns a little bit about you and connects you with the nearest resource. Because ultimately, if it is a mental health emergency, someone being able to come intervene is a possibility that might happen. And or the real hope is, if they chat with you and you require or simply are interested in longer term resources, they need to know who you are. So while we don't play as large a role as we once envisioned and dreamed, we are still, Flex is absolutely the choice for the contact center, or kind of the emergency hotline solution that might receive a warm transfer from 988. And that is the role that we are playing at this point. Although, we always hope for more opportunities to be involved in such an amazing resource as it takes off. Once, I think we see local infrastructures be ready to take on the volume of calls that I think 988 unleashed.
Well, you're spot on right there. I mean, 988 is very much following the path of 911, which in true United States style is 31 flavors, right? Everybody's doing it at their different rates and different times and in different ways, and it's a marathon, not a sprint. So there's certainly opportunity. And actually, I'm on one of the working groups for the National Emergency Number Association's one of the working groups for 911 988 interface. And what you're talking about right there with the warm transfers, that's exactly the topic we were talking about this week. And I think that, as 988 becomes more established, you're certainly going to see many, many different providers getting involved and running these call centers themselves. So excited to see where that leads. And certainly a very necessary component of our public safety and public health system.
Absolutely. And again, just because we've prioritized humanitarian assistance doesn't necessarily mean we've deprioritized, personal crisis intervention. But I think because we really want to take a global lens, and because mental health is something is almost, for lack of a better term, a luxury that some people get to think about it, slow down, process everything we've been through. We really wanted to be in the business of helping humanity meet their basic needs so that they could be in a position to take care of their mental health and well-being. And that begins with the work that you do, and that begins with the work that NRC and IFRC and all these amazing humanitarian assistance orgs does first. And that's safety and resiliency, and then we can think about the long term.
Absolutely. How would, one of the groups that we're focused on here in general are these community-based crisis response groups. And we get involved with them. Usually your traditional EMS, emergency medical services, ambulance providers, fire departments in low and middle income countries, but then in higher income countries where they have generally speaking, the 911 infrastructure in place, we get more involved with the community response groups. And so let's say that there is a community response group or a crisis response group, whatever label you want to put on them. Let's say that they've got an idea, they need to set up a hotline or they need to set up some way to send rapid communications. They don't have the technical expertise to do it, but they've got an idea of what they want to do. How would you recommend to them getting in touch? How do they interact, engage with Twilio?
Yeah, so we actually do have on our website a spot dedicated to supporting people in crisis that is meant to be a contact page. And it really isn't a black hole. Our team is small, but we really encourage folks interested in, any sort of crisis response or really disaster response, you name it, needs assessment, anything that is going to empower or allow your organization to scale, we really want to hear from you. So there's kind of two ways to do it. If you want to just say, hey, get out of my way, I want to sign right in and figure this out on my own, because we really are meant to be that tool for a particular cohort, and that would be someone a little bit more tech savvy and developer heavy. If you're not that, though, reach out, because we have a couple of avenues to ensure that folks get the support they need. We work very closely with a partner network, and as my role within crisis response humanitarian assistance, I am always on the lookout for systems integrators or those tech partners who will help you implement the technology, and in times of crisis or in the name of crisis will do so at more of a pro bono, low bono style. We recognize during crisis is not the time. So, we are really fans of the disaster forecasting model. And as your organization is thinking about what next year is going to look like and how technology might be able to play a role, I really encourage you to reach out. You can reach out to me personally too. on LinkedIn, or I'll even say my email because we want to be a part of this. We can help get ahead of that. We actually have a whole line of grants as well that we call digital innovation. And that type of grant is open to more organizations than just crisis. But the idea is we know we need technology. We really want to get there, but we need a little help financially and otherwise to make it happen. And those grants aren't Twilio specific. We really remain agnostic when it comes to a grant like that. But all this to say, twilio.com/crisis-response is a place that you can reach out, and we can certainly help make sure that you've got the technology you need. It might be as basic as SMS, chatbot, a phone call, whatever it needs to be. We've got connectivity in a whole lot of places, and we are not above finding another partner to fill a gap if we need to, connectivity wise, in a country who needs our support. So let us help. We'd love to be a part of it.
It's interesting you say that, because that's exactly what happened with us in Malawi. Was Twilio didn't have local phone numbers. So we were able to work with Twilio and local telecom providers to link them up. And the whole bring your own carrier model really worked well for us for that project. And also, again, in Haiti, same thing. Twilio didn't have local phone numbers, but we were able to work with Digicel. And in fact, the partner program you're mentioning is exactly how we did it too. With Vision Point Systems is one of your partners that we've been working with since the early years, and in fact introduced us to Twilio. So we're not only members, we're users too. What types of, let's say that organization has this whole idea on how they need to manage their communications. They don't have developers, but it sounds like they may be able to find some through your partner network. But their big concern, like all small organizations, is going to be costs. How does Twilio manage that? I mean, they've got to be very conscious about their budget, and they want to be spending their money on interventions, not the infrastructure. How does Twilio manage costs?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do this in a couple of ways. I think most importantly, the model by which one has an invoice or spends at Twilio is uniquely what we call a consumption model. You only pay for what you use. So that comes down to the number of texts that you send, the number of voice minutes, the phone number that you rent or own, are charged monthly for. So you don't have to commit to more than you ever spend. And for nonprofits, and especially those in crisis response, that's a really helpful model because it's incredibly spiky in nature, which is great for keeping costs down in general. On top of that, we offer discounts to nonprofits, a standard 25% discount across the board in everywhere that we can across every product set. Sometimes it's a little more, sometimes it's a little less, but more importantly, the team is dedicated to making it work financially. So then on top of that, we always offer a $500 credit. And just to give you an idea, that's the equivalent of about 80,000 US text messages. So oftentimes most nonprofits will sign up for the $500 credit, and that is all they will ever need for quite a while before they need anything else. But we really do work with you. Of course, it really depends on what channel you choose. And when I say that, does that mean you want SMS or voice? What country your phone number is going to be based in? And if we need to pull in another, carrier to make it happen, we certainly will. But that's essentially the model that we have found a lot of success with, not having to commit to a certain monthly rate, or you have to send this many text messages, because let's be real, for the first time you're doing this, you're piloting a project, you have no idea. And even if you did, that doesn't mean you want to commit to ever having to spend a certain amount of money.
Fantastic. That makes a lot of sense and can be very convenient. Can
I add one more thought on that?
Please.
Sorry. I just wanted to also mention, I did say we take the approach of product, people, and equity. And I haven't really mentioned beyond discounts what that means for product. Within crisis response as well, or really within our 3 focus areas that I mentioned earlier, climate action, humanitarian assistance, and global health equity, we also have a product credit fund. So if something happens and you need a little financial bridge, if you've come up with an innovative idea and you're dying to get started, if you just had a little help to demonstrate your success, or if what you're doing is so successful that with a little help you could scale beyond to another country, another level, whatever it might look like, we do offer product credit as a one-time bump of thank you for the great work that you do. We're so proud of just being able to be a part of it. So that's something you can always ask your Twilio.org specialist about to see if you fall under one of those three categories, how we can lend a supportive hand on a temporary basis as well.
That's great. That's great to know. Like you said, especially when you're talking about disaster response in particular, it's big spikes, right? There's huge activity, and then you won't hear anything for a while. We see this with the hurricane response groups, search and rescue teams and whatnot. In August, September, October, November, they are on call and can be hugely busy, very, very active. And then you don't hear anything from them for the rest of the year. But then when they come back to you, the next year, they expect the solution to be ready and the resiliency to be there so that they can get up and running again without any problems.
Absolutely.
So if you could just share with us, you've mentioned Norwegian Refugee Council, International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent, International Rescue Community. These are massive global non-governmental organizations with storied histories and huge reach. Can you think of any maybe smaller organizations that you've been working with recently on a more local level that have benefited from Twilio services?
Yeah, I know those are some big names, and it's tough to ignore the big guys that can get in the door quickly in some of the senses. One of and this is probably still kind of a big name, but I'll do my best to think of a few here. One partnership that we've just taken to a new level with this humanitarian assistance focus, whose work, at least with Twilio, is still growing and started a little bit smaller, was World Central Kitchen. And they actually leveraged Twilio in a really cool text to order way, which is a smaller subset of the incredible work that they do, not just when they helicopter in and build a kitchen out of nowhere and serve thousands of meals overnight, but actually in some of the smaller disasters that you can think of, Highland Park shooting being an example, they actually go on the ground in much smaller use cases to provide meals to those who are mourning. And that is a text to order service for pickup, and you get to order meals. And it's just one less thing you have to think about when the only thing you can think about is how you're going to get through the next day. So even though they're a huge brand, I love the little bit more grassroots approach to using Twilio that they take. And we're excited to see how that might be able to scale to more of a disaster level. But that is one of my favorite stories.
Absolutely. The big organization, small scale deployment makes a lot of sense. On that note, we've been talking about nonprofit organizations, non-governmental organizations, but I'm wondering about, especially in this day and age in the United States, crisis response is on the tip of every city manager's tongue, right? And municipalities are getting much more involved in this diversification of their crisis response system. Can you think of any examples offhand of when you've been working with municipalities? Whether they're sending out mass messages to everybody in town or they're working with local groups. Do you have any examples offhand of more city-led initiatives?
Yeah, so we actually have two different use cases of Flex that came up on more of a city basis. One in response to COVID and not being able to offer their services live anymore. That was actually 311 in the city of Pittsburgh. They were able to stand up Flex to allow all of their workers to continue to meet their needs for the community while at home, which is a little bit more unique. And then another example is actually Southwest Texas Regional Advisory Council. I love this story. They stood up Flex overnight as a means to track the logistics of vaccine deployment for COVID as well. So, and that system might be used a little bit differently now because they use it with the National Guard, with National Guard volunteers in Texas. But ultimately, it allowed for a quick and easy way to go across both text messaging and phone to check in and understand where all of the vaccines were deployed to what pharmacies, local, doctors' offices, to make sure that they all got to where they needed to go. So a little bit more logistics on that one, but I love the way that our technology kind of filled that quick role overnight, which I believe you've seen some of those use cases on your technology too, right? Especially shine more recently as we enter hurricane season. Has that come up?
You're exactly right. There is a group in Florida, a group associated with the IAFF that has been providing mental health counseling services to firefighters and EMS other first responders who were directly affected by Hurricane Ian. And I mean, this is something that gets overlooked all the time, but when hurricanes hit, the first responders are affected too. One the classic example was what happened in New Orleans after Katrina, where in the media you hear that the New Orleans Police Department basically laid down their arms and gave the city over to the bandits, when what really happened was New Orleans Police Department needed to go home and take care of their families because their houses were flooded. And so there are real pressures on these groups. And one of the groups that we've been supporting is providing mental health services to those first responders who were affected directly. So that's been really invigorating to see because, like you said, it happened overnight. One night they sign up for the account, and the next morning they are actively using our software to do it. But to your point about municipalities, we've seen in Litchfield County, Connecticut, the Litchfield County Opioid Task Force, they have been using Twilio, that when somebody calls their health hotline, the calls get forwarded to any number of different people that are on call and will receive those calls on their personal phones depending on the schedule. And the schedule was all set up through Twilio as well. So we got a great guy named Daryl, who's a real expert Twilio user, and set up the scheduling, all the different people that are on call. And what happens is when there are overdose spike alerts sent out, they then use our software Beacon to dispatch community responders, volunteers, to go out to hotspots and distribute harm reduction supplies to try and prevent more fatal overdoses from happening. And so when there's bad stuff going around or stuff that's been laced with fentanyl and there's a big spike in overdoses, they'll get calls through Twilio, and then they'll use our Beacon dispatch to get their volunteers out onto the streets and try and prevent more overdoses from happening. And it's amazing the tools that you have to make all this possible, the end-to-end communications, really transforming their operations at the local level. And I'll add very affordably. But yeah, we're
That's incredible.
always excited to see this stuff. It never, I'm sure you are in the same position. It never ceases to amaze me the ideas that people come up with about how they can respond at the local level. And it usually comes down to, we've got everything in place, but it's the communications that we can't do. And they're always very scared of the costs. And when we introduce them to your software and our software, you can feel the burden being lifted off their shoulders.
Absolutely. And I do love, through times of crisis in our product credit fund, we've seen 1-2 man shows who have a little bit of development skill bring something incredibly powerful to life. There were a few examples that I can think of, but I Can Help That host, quickly spun up by some volunteers locally in Ukraine and Poland, to simply match people, refugees in need of housing, with folks offering housing nearby. It's just so neat to see that, yes, we have incredible organizations who thankfully take the time to do this, and we can make this affordable, but how powerful to also watch one person change the world with a little help from technology.
You're really hitting on an important point there. We see time and time again these small grassroots organizations, 5 people are responding to hundreds of incidents all by themselves. And it really doesn't take an army to make a difference. And to your point, I personally can't write a line of code to save my life, but I have been able to get into Twilio and jerry rig some call forwarding solutions for people with no skills whatsoever. So if you're willing to, a little trial and error can get you can take you a long way.
Love it. And I want to mention we have a code exchange at Twilio and a whole section called Code Exchange for Good. Those are essentially what we've tried to do, is when we figure out that a technology is being used by a whole lot of people in a way that's pretty impactful, we like to try and kind of build that template up and share it so it becomes low code. I can't say no code, but it sure does become a little bit easier. That includes everything from virtual classrooms to vaccine hesitancy bots to virtual medical visits, connecting volunteers, rapid response broadcasting. Some of this stuff is already there and is templated out so you don't have to start from scratch. So it's really worth exploring. Again, that's our Code Exchange for Good at Twilio. So definitely worth checking out as a place to start.
Yes, and I noticed too, actually, on this whole call forwarding thing, the way I did it was there are tutorial videos in Studio where they're like, "What do you want to do?" And then they show you how to do it. And if you can follow the instructions, you can get a lot done. So we love the low code, but we are certainly rooting for no code. And
Totally.
we're on the mailing list, so excited to hear about that whenever it happens in all the different channels that you offer.
Yeah. And I'll mention we just participated in a really cool partnership with Monday.com, another really great technology that complements Twilio nicely in their solutions. But they also really just want to see tech access just broadened across nonprofits. They created a platform called Digital Lift, which is a whole lot of different tech companies that provide videos step by step as to how to leverage their tools. And Twilio put one on there in partnership with TextIt, and TextIt is essentially a platform that does require zero code. So you get to use Twilio under the hood and benefit from our phenomenal discounts for nonprofits and social enterprises, but you don't have to code. And Digital Lift on Monday.com has a ton more resources across different technologies. Really cool place to explore. Hey, maybe you guys can find a tool that can meet your needs a little faster than you'd ever think possible.
That's excellent. We'll definitely check that out, and I'm sure some of our listeners will as well. Devin, thank you so much for your time. It's really a pleasure. Love what you're doing, and Twilio has been very good to us over the years, and hopefully we can help more organizations get involved because the services you guys have got are second to none. So thank you so much. And
Thank you guys.
absolutely, it's a real pleasure, and we will definitely be in contact.
You know it. Keep sharing your wonderful stories with us. We love the work that you guys do all over the world. We're lucky to be a part of it.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Bye bye.